Before we begin, there is something uncomfortable you need to hear. Most people spend years trying to heal their lives without ever questioning the one relationship that shaped their inner world the most. Their mother. Not because they hate her, not because they blame her, but because the mind protects that bond at all costs. So instead, they search for answers everywhere else. Self-help books, new relationships, meditation, motivation, success. They try to become stronger, wiser, more confident. And yet, something inside them still reacts like a child waiting to be chosen. Carl Jung believed this happens for a reason, because long before you learned language, long before you understood the world, your psyche was already learning one silent lesson: what love feels like. And the person who taught that lesson was your mother. Tonight's story begins in a place most people know very well but rarely think about. A hospital corridor at 2:17 in the morning. The fluorescent lights hum quietly. Machines beep in distant rooms. A young man named Daniel sits alone on a plastic chair, staring at the floor while the smell of antiseptic fills the air. His phone vibrates. "Mom!" He stares at the screen. For a moment he considers ignoring it, but his thumb moves automatically. "Hello?" Her voice is calm. Too calm. "Why didn't you tell me you were at the hospital?" Daniel hesitates, because the truth is something he has never admitted, not even to himself. He didn't call her because deep down, he already knew what her reaction would be. A short silence. Then she sighs softly. "You always make things harder than they need to be." The call ends a minute later, and Daniel sits there feeling something strangely familiar. Not anger, not sadness, something older. A quiet tension in the chest, like a child who just realized he disappointed someone again. Years later, Carl Jung would describe this invisible force with a name many people have never heard before: the mother complex. And here is the truth most people never realize. Your mother is not only a person in your past, she is also a psychological structure inside your mind, an inner voice, an emotional blueprint, a lens through which you experience love, rejection, approval, and self-worth, which means something very unsettling. Even if your mother is far away, even if you rarely speak, a part of her may still be quietly living inside your decisions, inside your fears, inside the way you treat yourself when no one else is watching. And until you recognize that presence, no healing is possible. If this topic resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These videos explore the hidden psychological patterns that quietly shape our lives, patterns most people never learn to see. Because once you begin to understand them, you begin to understand yourself. And Daniel was about to discover something that would change the way he saw his entire life. Not about his mother, but about the version of her that had been living inside his mind all along. Daniel did not think about that phone call again for several weeks. Life moved forward the way it always does. Work, meetings, traffic, emails that felt urgent but meant nothing a month later. On the outside, everything looked normal. Daniel had a good job, a clean apartment, friends who occasionally invited him out on weekends, and yet there was one pattern he could never fully explain. Every relationship in his life followed the same strange rhythm. At first, everything felt effortless. He was attentive, supportive, almost instinctively aware of what the other person needed. People often told him the same thing. "You're incredibly understanding. You're easy to talk to. You always know exactly what to say." Daniel took pride in that. It felt like proof that he was a good partner, a thoughtful man. But something always changed after a while. The moment a relationship became emotionally deeper, something inside him shifted. He began to watch more carefully. The tone of a message, a delayed reply, a small change in someone's mood. His mind would quietly ask the same question it had learned many years ago. Did I do something wrong? Soon he would start trying harder. More patience, more understanding, more effort to keep the connection stable. And strangely, the more he tried to preserve the relationship, the more exhausted he became. Until eventually something broke. Sometimes the other person would leave, saying they felt overwhelmed. Other times, Daniel would slowly withdraw, telling himself he simply needed more space. But after every ending, the same silent feeling remained. A strange emotional hunger, as if something essential had almost been found, but never quite reached. Carl Jung believed that moments like this are rarely random, because when emotional patterns repeat themselves across different relationships, the cause is usually not in the present. It is hidden somewhere deeper. Jung described the mother as the first emotional environment the psyche ever experiences. Before we understand words, before we understand logic, we learn something much more fundamental. We learn whether the world feels safe, A baby cannot analyze love. It can only feel its presence or its absence, warmth, attention, comfort, or distance, tension, uncertainty. These emotional signals become the very first map of existence inside the nervous system, and slowly, without realizing it, the child begins forming an inner image of what love means, not intellectually, emotionally. For some children, that image becomes a foundation of safety. For others, it becomes something far more complicated. Because when emotional warmth feels unpredictable, the child learns a quiet survival strategy. Pay attention, watch carefully, adapt quickly, do whatever is necessary to keep the connection from disappearing. Many years later, that same strategy can still be operating inside the adult mind, not as a memory, but as a reflex, a way of moving through relationships without ever realizing where it came from. And one evening, sitting alone in his apartment after another relationship had quietly ended, Daniel began asking himself a question that had never fully formed before. Why does love always feel like something I have to maintain instead of something I can simply receive? The answer to that question had been forming inside him long before he could speak, and it had everything to do with the first person who ever taught him what love was supposed to feel like. Daniel was 8 years old the first time he learned something about emotions that would follow him for the rest of his life. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window while the television murmured in the background. The house smelled faintly of coffee and detergent. His mother sat at the table, staring at nothing in particular. Not angry, not crying. Just distant. Daniel stood in the doorway holding a drawing he had spent the entire afternoon making. Crayons had stained his fingers blue and red. It was a simple picture. A small house, a tree, 3 stick figures holding hands. He walked slowly toward the table. "Mom, look what I made." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she glanced at the paper for less than a second. "That's nice, Daniel." Her eyes returned to the empty space in front of her, and something subtle happened inside the child's mind. Not disappointment, something quieter. A realization. Her world was somewhere else. Children are incredibly perceptive when it comes to emotional absence. They notice shifts adults often ignore, but they almost never blame the parent. Carl Jung understood this very well, because the child's psyche cannot easily accept the idea that the person responsible for their safety is unavailable. That truth would feel too dangerous. So the mind finds another explanation, one that feels safer even if it hurts. Maybe I asked at the wrong time, maybe she's tired, maybe I should try harder next time. Without realizing it, Daniel folded the drawing quietly and placed it on the table. He didn't ask again. Moments like this rarely look dramatic from the outside. There are no arguments, no obvious trauma. But in the invisible language of the psyche, something important is being recorded. The child begins to learn a subtle rule: love must be approached carefully, emotions must be managed, needs must be controlled, because when warmth feels uncertain, the safest strategy becomes adaptation. Years later, this adaptation often turns into something people admire: sensitivity, empathy, the ability to read a room instantly. People like Daniel become incredibly aware of other people's moods. They notice small emotional shifts most others completely miss, but Carl Jung warned that this ability often comes with a hidden cost. The child slowly stops expecting emotional care and starts providing it instead. Without noticing it, the role quietly reverses. Instead of being the one who is comforted, the child becomes the one who maintains emotional balance. And when that child grows into an adult, something strange begins to happen in relationships. They become exceptionally good at understanding others, but strangely uncomfortable receiving the same care in return. Not because they don't want it, but because somewhere deep in their nervous system, love still feels like something fragile, something that must be preserved, something that can disappear if they stop paying attention. And one night, sitting alone in the quiet of his apartment, Daniel suddenly remembered that drawing. He had not thought about it in years, but the feeling was still there. The quiet moment when a child learns that being seen is not always guaranteed, and that realization had been quietly shaping his relationships ever since. Years passed before Daniel began to notice the deeper pattern. Not in therapy, not in a dramatic life crisis, but in something much quieter. A moment of unexpected honesty with himself. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The city outside his apartment moved slowly, the distant noise of traffic drifting through the open window. Daniel sat on the couch staring at a message he had typed, but had not sent. It was addressed to his mother. Not angry, not confrontational, just a simple question he had carried for years. Why did it always feel like I had to be the strong one? His thumb hovered over the screen, Then he slowly locked the phone and placed it on the table, because somewhere deep down, he already understood something difficult. Even if she answered, the past would not change. Carl Jung believed this moment is where many people get stuck. They believe healing means confronting the parent, analyzing every memory, searching for the moment when everything went wrong, and sometimes that can bring temporary relief. But Jung warned about a subtle trap hidden in that approach, because as long as your emotional life revolves around your mother, whether through blame, resentment, or constant analysis, the psychological structure remains the same. You are still the child, and she is still the center of your inner world. The real shift begins somewhere else. Not when you understand your mother, but when you understand the image of her that lives inside you. Because the mother in your psyche is no longer just a person. She has become something else. An inner voice, a quiet emotional authority, the one that whispers when you doubt yourself, the one that silently asks if you are doing enough, being enough, deserving enough. Daniel began to notice that voice everywhere. When he made a mistake at work, when someone he cared about became distant, when he felt the familiar urge to try harder, explain more, fix things faster. The voice never sounded cruel. That was the strange part. It sounded reasonable. You should do better. You could have handled that differently. Maybe you asked for too much. And for years, he believed those thoughts were simply his own personality. Until one evening, reading a passage from Carl Jung, he came across a sentence that stopped him completely. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." Daniel read it again, slowly, because something inside him suddenly clicked into place. For the first time, he realized something unsettling. A part of his life had not been shaped only by what his mother did, but by the silent emotional world she carried inside herself. Her exhaustion, her quiet disappointments, the weight she never spoke about. And somewhere along the way, Daniel had unconsciously made a decision as a child, a promise he never remembered making, a promise that sounded something like this. "I will not be happier than you. I will not be freer than you. I will not build a life that makes you feel left behind." The promise had no words, but it had been quietly guiding his life for years. And breaking that invisible loyalty would require something that felt almost impossible. Not anger, not rebellion, but the courage to live a life that no longer revolved around waiting to be emotionally chosen. And that realization was the beginning of something Daniel had never experienced before. Not blame, not forgiveness, something much more unsettling. Freedom. Freedom rarely arrives the way people imagine. There is no dramatic moment, no sudden feeling that everything has been resolved. For Daniel, it began with something much smaller. A quiet realization one evening while walking through the city park. Children were playing near the fountain. Parents sat on benches talking softly while the sky slowly turned orange with the setting sun. Daniel watched a little boy run toward his mother, holding something in his hands. A small drawing. The woman leaned down, smiling as she looked at it. For a moment, Daniel felt the familiar ache rising in his chest. That old emotional reflex, the one that had followed him for years. But this time, something inside him responded differently. For the first time, he didn't feel anger toward his mother. He didn't feel the need to analyze her choices. Instead, he saw something he had never fully considered before. She had been a human being long before she became his mother. A person with fears, exhaustion, dreams that perhaps never unfolded the way she once imagined. Carl Jung believed that healing begins when we see our parents not as symbols, but as incomplete human beings. Not gods, not villains, just people. And that realization changes something fundamental inside the psyche. Because when the parent becomes human, the child is finally free to grow. Daniel sat on a bench and closed his eyes for a moment. For years he had waited for something that could never truly arrive. Recognition, perfect understanding, the exact form of love he once needed. But real healing did not begin when he received those things. It began when he stopped waiting for them. Because another truth slowly became clear. The most important mother in his life was no longer the woman who raised him. It was the voice inside his own mind, the way he spoke to himself when he failed, the patience he offered himself when he struggled, the boundaries he allowed himself to protect. Jung called this process individuation, not becoming perfect, becoming whole, learning to become the psychological parent of your own inner world. That means offering yourself the safety that may have been missing, the understanding you once searched for, the permission to exist without constantly proving your worth. Because the most dangerous part of the mother complex is not what your mother once did. It is the moment you begin repeating that same emotional pattern toward yourself. The cycle finally breaks when that voice changes, when judgment slowly becomes awareness, when criticism becomes patience, when the child inside you is no longer waiting for someone else to arrive. Daniel stood up and began walking again as the evening lights flickered on across the park. For the first time in years, his life no longer felt like a quiet attempt to earn love. It felt like something else, something open, something unfinished. And maybe that is the real truth Carl Jung wanted us to understand. Healing does not erase the past, it changes the way the past lives inside you. So here is a question worth asking yourself tonight. How much of your life is still being guided by the mother who lives inside your unconscious? Not the real woman as she is today, but the image of her that formed inside you long ago. Because the moment you begin to see that pattern clearly, you stop living only as the child shaped by the past. And slowly, something new begins to emerge. A life guided by awareness instead of old emotional reflexes. If this idea resonated with you, the next video appearing on your screen explores another hidden psychological pattern Carl Jung believed quietly shapes our relationships and identity. And once you see it, you may never look at your own behavior the same way again.